Hello, welcome back, everyone. So, out of the meeting we had last week, I think, with Satish and Hua on the PCI-LMT, one of the things that I've observed there was that we may need a message or artifact of some type for test fixtures definition. Then again, that's maybe part of the input parameters? No, not really. No, that doesn't make sense because it is the diag package itself that defines what the test fixture for a specific step is. So the question is, do we need such a thing? Do we need to specify it? How do we specify it? And opinions.
It may help, Adrian, if you give a little context on the problem that we're solving.
Yeah. So the PCI-LMT tool is a diag package which is exercising the timing and voltage aspects on PCI lanes on hardware. So basically what we can do there with specific hardware support is to offset either the timing of the signals or the voltage, vertical voltage of the signals, and see whether we start getting errors on the PCI lanes. And basically the tool decides that, I want to offset for this particular test step by whatever amount of millivolts, and then exercise the hardware and see the errors, right? But this offset specifically, whether it's voltage or whatever, technically qualifies as a test fixture, right? For that particular test step. And so far, I don't think we have this concept of test fixture in the spec.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think test fixture is an interesting name for it, right? Like I would probably say it's the parameters of the measurement that you're making. But for us, I'll speak on my own behalf, right? I don't know that it's offers a lot of value because what we find is that ultimately we take all of this data that we generate and we drop it into some type of database, right? Where we're analyzing it for all the things that you do. You look for minimums, maximums, and averages, and medians, and standard deviations, and all that stuff. But rarely does that database understand like multiple parameters, right? So what we always usually do is just encode it in the measurement name, as we discussed, obviously earlier this morning for the benefit of other folks that weren't there. So like for instance, if you're taking I'm just going to make something up, like something simple. We'll say like a voltage drop at 5 volts, right? You might do a voltage drop across a resistor at 5 volts or 10 volts or 15 volts to determine some type of tolerance or something for it. We would just say, 10-volt voltage drop, 5-volt voltage drop in the measurement name and kind of leave it at that and then keep the analysis simple. That's the way we've dealt with it in the past. I do admit when you're changing 3 or 4 or 5 different parameters, it can get crazy. But I think once again, is if you did structure that data, whatever system you drop that data in would have to reflect that too. So you're just kind of moving the problem. You're not fixing it.
So the thing with this is, okay, it looks okay at the current usage level, let's say. One of the points that you highlighted was that the name can be arbitrarily large, right? Because the name is now used as a serialization container for this test parameters or whatever you want to call the concept. I'm using test fixture because it's kind of standard in other places. Also, this output is for the main goal of the output is for machine consumption, right? You can look at it as a human because that's why it's JSON, but it's for machine consumption. So when you need to parse the output to add a different layer of diagnostics or whatever on top of it, so it's not consumed by the test executor directly, then this kind of becomes fragile, right? Because you need to know exactly what the encoding for this test step name is, and I don't think this is a good way to actually encode this information. That's why I'm asking. Maybe it is a good idea to have something else. To your point of all of this gets dumped to a database, yes, that is valid only if the immediate next layer is the test executive, which may not be the case. Any other opinions?
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
You have a lot of echo, Satish. Can't really understand what you're saying.
Okay, that's fine. I will sync up with you and offline. Yeah, I think I would like to know more about the test fixture, like what exactly you are having in mind, like what goes into it, and if it's really needed, like that.
Yeah, maybe we can just start with a proposal, I guess, and continue the discussion from that. I know it's the discussion is kind of vague right now, and there isn't something to look at, which kind of detracts from the discussion, right?
Right.
But you know, at a very high level, looks to me like kind of a gap in this.
Yeah, I think maybe one more comment. I do agree with Satish. Having an example would be worth a million words here, right? So we should probably just have the example. But the one point where I think our opinions diverge is you mentioned, like the thing consuming it would have to know the encoding, right? And I do agree with you if you're going to decode it. What I guess my position is that you probably won't need to decode it. If you do need to do that, the smart human can probably look at it and figure it out, but I don't know that the machine would need to be able to decode it in any way.
Considering it's in the name fields, you are correct. Yes, because the name isn't something that should be decoded. So the fact that you encode the parameters inside the name is actually meant for human consumption. The argument though is, what if you have something else than a human and a test executive on top of this?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. In fact, if we were proposing sort of owning the end-to-end chain here, I would probably agree with you that we probably should kind of come up with some type of structure to convey this. But where we don't own the end-to-end chain, I think that the work may not pay off because like the downstream work to make use of it is so high.
So I'll talk with Satish about this, and I think we can get an example out of the LMT tool specifically because we already have that on the table.
Yeah, I would also recommend like in the week send a sample output from this tool. I think that has both passing and failing condition. So probably we can also start from there. That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is done.
Adrian, can I ask you a question on, I joined the meeting a little late here, and can I ask for a clarification on the term test fixture? Do you mean by it, because when Dan was clarifying that fixture does sometimes mean sort of an external node or station to reach a device under test, for example, which is how I would think of it, which I don't think is the reference here. Are we talking about something like a sensor name or something like that if we reach a BMC? In an analogy for a BMC read, would it be the sensor name? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I've been using test fixture because I'm more used with like software testing, which essentially you say, okay, for these parameters, do the exercise, right? So in this case, I'm not referring to external semantics or specification for the test. It's the diagnostic itself deciding, okay, for this particular test step, where I'm doing measurements for BER, for example, everything has been offset by this amount of voltage and by this amount of time. So as Dan says, it's kind of the parameters
Okay.
for the test.
Okay, thanks.
Right. So since we have more people on the call now, I would jump in a quick status. So I can start with the meeting that we had last week, I think, with Satish and Hua. We got a bit more progress on the mapping for the PCI-LMT tool. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Satish or Hua.
No, I think, yeah, that's really useful. I think we need to have one more, probably more such meetings, like just dedicated session just to go through the output format and probably expand it to the input as well. That we end up having something like an input to decide whether the tool to provide like all the HWI follow-up topics. So yeah, would like to have more such sessions.
Okay, thanks for that. Igor, I think we're ready right now with the mem tester, right? Would it be useful to have some sort of binary distribution for that binary package directly on GitHub, maybe for a x86 64 arch?
Binary distribution, could you clarify what you mean?
So I am thinking of an artifact that you can just call off GitHub and run immediately.
Like an archive with Python script and mem tester that is included as a binary.
Maybe an archive is a better format in this case. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, remind me. I don't recall right now. Do we have a PyPy release?
No, it's purely on GitHub.
Okay, so we kind of need to decide between PyPy and the archive at this point, just for immediate usage. What I want to get at is, okay, I go to GitHub on the project page and I download something and it just works.
Okay, I mean, archive would be the simplest solution. Also, I feel like the scope of this utility is very narrow. So is it worth of publishing it in PyPy, or maybe we keep it as an archive? Because I mean, the audience of this, the user base for this tool is very limited.
Maybe it is useful to publish to PyPy, and maybe we can also embed the binary in it, because you can't do that. So basically, it's the same archive that we're talking about right now, but only published to PyPy, so you can do pip install with it.
Oh, okay. So we can start with an archive and then publish it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you wanna start with that, let me know if you need any help.
Okay, I'll look into that.
It's not urgent. Okay. Venkat, do we have any update on the SSD things and maybe the exploration on CTAM?
Yeah, so the SSD test cases, I think the plan is still to I think do initial version without the OCP DAG format in January, and then follow it up in a few weeks with the CTAM. Sorry, the OCP DAG. Although the efforts are going in parallel, so it's more a question of figuring out when we release it into the Open Compute GitHub. On the CTAM exploration, I got some step-by-step guide from Microsoft, so I was able to kind of get it to a like discovery part, and thanks Adrian for figuring out the contribution model. I think that's something once we start like getting some of the RAS test cases into the spec, something like Meta will looking to also add tests to, and working internally as well to get it into our automation frameworks.
All right. Thanks for that, Venkat. I will add another thing, which is on PCI crawler. Paul isn't here. I'll ask him to join maybe next week if he's available. I did another iteration for him, so maybe we can get done with this soon. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I had a well, I guess it's more of an opinion than a question. For the SSD diagnostics and the question of like when do we go and release them to the OCP? It seems like we probably wouldn't want to do that until they're in the compliant format. Are you guys pretty much aligned with that? Otherwise, I think we may confuse people a little bit.
Yeah, so I believe the plan is to release on this the Facebook incubator GitHub, and then when it's in the compliant format, we can release it into the open compute.
Okay, maybe one more follow-up question, because we fall into this pattern a lot where, you know, we sort of have like a tool or a utility, and then we diagify it, if that's a word, right? Where we wrap it in like a wrapper to create the OCP format. Is that sort of like the long-term strategy that you guys would probably look at? Would you want to keep the sort of meta repo there consistently forever and then have the OCP version of it? Or are you thinking, no, when you go to the OCP version, you just get rid of the other repo?
I think we get rid of the other repo because we are building it into the test framework itself that these test cases are coming into. But yeah, the diagify I'm kind of doing for a couple of other things internally, like Adrian helped me with that too. But on this one, it's going to be natively built into the framework, the kind of the OCP TV extension. So we probably want to just move the entire repo.
But I think the other repo is private, right?
Correct.
Because it's, yeah, so there is no other repo technically from a public standpoint.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Venkat. That makes sense to me.
Go ahead, Vince.
Hey, sorry, I'm not fully awake yet, so I'm still at the previous discussion about Memtester with Igor. I'm kind of catching up. The archive and the PyPI discussion. So I wanted to kind of make a case for PyPI from a consumer client side. I wanted to tease Igor, maybe your thoughts on favoring archive versus PyPI, if we can linger on that just a couple of minutes, just to understand the parameters, because that could set a good precedent for how we want to contribute these types of things. So what's making you lean on the archive over PyPI, or is there friction with PyPI?
It's not about friction, it's probably about usefulness of placing it in PyPI. So like if nobody needs it and everybody who wants to use it can just download it from GitHub, then why not? Because usually you publish something that is relatively popular and generally useful on PyPI. But this is very niche tool, I would say. Also, since you need to publish a binary and there will be some, security aspects of it. Do data center owners want to download binaries from external source such as PyPI? I don't know. Probably no.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do have a probably a dumb question. When I think of PyPI, I think of like libraries that people want to import into their programs, but like what Igor has is more of an application.
That's not entirely correct, Dan. You can have binary distributions on PyPI that are only Python scripts, but at installation time, it also installs like a symlink or something, and then you have the system level binary that actually runs the Python scripts. So it can act as a binary.
Pip is an example of that, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I stand corrected.
Go ahead, Kiran.
I think PyPI sort of helps being able to script things rather than maybe we could do technically a wget, but probably PyPI fits in better if you want to script installing the various requirements.
So these aren't exclusive. The question was, what do we start with? And we can start with the archive and then add PyPI.
So to be clear, what do we get in the archive we wouldn't get in PyPI? Are we talking about the source?
If the question is for me, then I see
No,
the
it's more
message
for
open.
Igor. Sorry, Adrian. Yeah, I wanted to be clear on in that sort of decision matrix of archive versus PyPI. Are we saying that in the archive we would be getting the source as well, or and then we would fetch it from GitHub, or what's kind of the trade-off?
If I understand it correctly, the difference will be that in PyPI you just publish it in a central repo, whereas in archive case you just have the same data, same content, but on the GitHub side. That's the only difference. And we can actually do both. Publish it as an archive on GitHub and publish it in PyPI. But both cases do not solve this problem of security, because we will include a binary there.
So I think there's an option in PyPI, or rather in the packaging part, where you can say optional dependencies, and maybe that could be the way to actually just get the Python source and say, okay, I have memtester binary on the system, I just want the sources, or get it with the embedded memtest binary. But we can look at that.
What about the source code itself? I guess data center owners would need to audit code, right? And this is easier to do if you just, have a local copy of the repo, rather than if you just download an archive and import it manually. So what about this aspect?
PyPy will give you the sources and clear, so you can do the audit.
Right. But, well, okay.
It's a bit of a detail. We can talk about that separately. I think what you should get out of this discussion is that there is a lot of interest in memtester, so we should package it in a way that is useful for people.
I mean, yeah, it's not a big deal to package it. So yeah, I can start with an archive and then we can publish it in PyPy and see how it goes.
Yeah, Igor, I'll send you a link. I've got to admit, I'm somewhat ignorant of what they're doing and what the project is, but there is the Google Trusted Source Initiative, where they're going through and they're basically doing static analysis and things on popular packages, looking for vulnerabilities, things like, Flask and things like that that are very commonly used. We might look to see what it would take to get maybe memtester included in that, see what the barrier to entry would be for us to go through their standard battery of security checks and everything else there. It may offer no value at all, but it may be worth us looking into at least.
Yeah, it may be interesting.
Okay. Dan, you had a question last time on the progress on virtual client. I do not recall if you're satisfied with the answer last time, or do we want another status now?
Yeah, I think the answer was last time. We're working on it. Maybe if Young's here. Young, any news on your side?
Yeah. So this week, Sergey replied. He said he will work on this now. So I'm working with him. I sent him a couple guides, and he's following through them right now.
Okay, sounds good. I did talk to Sergey. You mentioned there was an interaction that you were waiting for Sergey for, and he wasn't aware of it, so I asked him to reach out to you. I don't know if he managed to do that or not yet.
Yeah, basically I was waiting for him to try. I already sent him the instructions, and this week he finally, I think he's starting working on this. Yeah, thank you again.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Okay, then. Thanks for all of the updates. Is there anything I missed? If that's the case, just raise a hand and I'll name you.
Just because, sorry, Adrian, I apologize for abruptly interrupting. Just because I have to drop off, I was wondering if we could discuss what our holiday calendar looks like for the upcoming year. I imagine we're meeting next week, but probably not the week after that. Is that correct?
Yes. I don't think we were recording initially, but the last week in December is canceled. That is 27th. We discussed this last week. Next week will still happen if there are no other opinions. And are you also asking about January 3rd, maybe?
Well, I know that we will have a lot of folks off that week, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should cancel a meeting because of it. I'll be here. So it sounds like we only take the 27th off and then we're back on the 3rd.
Let's make a poll, maybe. Anyone to cancel on January 3rd? Please raise hands.
Yeah, I vote to cancel on the 3rd.
I have one for Vincent, Marcos. Okay, couple of hands, not really a majority.
I want to raise my hand. I'm just trying to figure out what.
Okay, so there's a couple of people, and I think we should have the general forum that we have. So maybe we cancel January 3rd as well. You okay with that then?
I'm fine with it. The alternative would be is for the folks that did want to attend, we could like maybe deep dive on a topic that would interest other people potentially. But I'm good either way. It's the wisdom of the crowd wins.
Okay then. So December 27th and next following week, January the 3rd, are both canceled meetings. Okay then. There's a couple more items on the agenda. They're all from me. One is related to George, which I do not see on the call, so maybe skip on that one. And the other one is from last week, which was a question from you on whether the diagnosis artifact should be at step level or run level, because right now it is at run level. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, that's a great point, Adrian. I think we spent. I'm guessing you put that on because of the discussions we had, the active discussions on the skip, right? Yeah, and it does sound like that's, to me, in hindsight, that does seem like there should absolutely be one at step. It does seem like a gap there.
So I'm trying to look at the spec in parallel. There is the test step end has part of a diagnosis in it, because it says, okay, this step was successful. Actually, I need to look. So the test step end has a status field, and the status can be complete error or skip. So kind of overlaps a bit with the diagnosis, but it doesn't say, okay, the test step was deemed as an error because of a reason. We do not have the reason for the error. And in the same way, we don't have the reason for a skip. But then again, if we add diagnosis on a step level, maybe it kind of muddies the water a bit in terms of semantics, because the diagnosis is supposed to say, okay, for this test run, it either passed or it didn't pass, or something happened, and this is what what happened, right, with the message and verdict and all of that. Whereas at step level, it's not exactly the same thing, because the steps may, like a step could error out and the whole run could still be successful, right? Because that's that's the decision that the diagnostic took. So maybe this is a bit vague in the way I'm phrasing it right now. I don't have a good proposal for this. I'm just asking whether it would be an idea to add a diagnosis object to steps as well, or some kind of equivalent. Yes, Igor.
I have a question. Why do we need test steps in the first place? Because I didn't see any usage of test steps internally, I think, at least on the machine level, where so we basically use them for human only, right? So we split diags into test steps. They run silently, but I don't think I saw anything about statuses of certain steps. So basically, we don't parse results of separate steps, unless I'm mistaken. Maybe somebody from my team can correct me. So to me, it looks like a human abstraction rather than something that, provides structured data.
It kind of depends. If the next consumer is a test executor, generally you would say that the steps are not relevant. They're just there for documentation purposes, and it is a human abstraction. Like if you want to go and debug and get a bit more structure in the data that the diagnostic outputted. But it could be that you have a different consumer on top, which is allowed by the spec and maybe arguably encouraged in some ways. So think of, for example, of a binary that only produces measurements, and then you have something on top which looks at the measurements and produces diagnostics. And you want to separate that logic for whatever reason. So in that case, you would have some steps which specify how the hardware was exercised, and you have the measurements within those step contexts. And then the thing on top, looking at all of this data, will look on a per step basis to say, okay, this hardware is okay from a diagnostic standpoint.
Yeah, I get the point about the second layer that actually raises the diagnosis. I didn't get why we need test steps for this purpose. It's like we name all the measurements, right? So they can be fetched based on the name of the measurement. So
yeah, but they're in the context of a test step, right? And generally, so I guess this kind of came out of how tests are usually viewed and run. Like you have a test run and it has steps, and the steps do something, right? But they're like a smaller context scope, basically.
Okay, I see. One more question. So we have these test steps, right? And if we create a sequence of test steps, we cannot reuse them, right, in other diags, for example. So I would understand if we had test steps that could be, composed to form a new diag, but this is not the case right now, right? So test step is not like a unit that you can, attach to something else. So would it be more useful if we could compose test steps somehow? Just thinking out loud.
Could you clarify the reuse aspect?
It's like, for example, sometimes you need to pre-install packages so that you can run certain tests, right? And pre-installing packages may be a separate test step. Now, this functionality of installing a package, it sounds universal, and you may want to use it in multiple diags, for example. So why would we need? Yeah.
Well, the test steps are kind of a chronological aspect as well, right? It's not a reusable code block semantically. It's a documentation of what the diagnostic package did at the time.
I see. It's more for informational purpose rather than for, creating some useful functionality for us. I see.
But
Yeah,
consider
it's
the
not
idea
so.
of
Go ahead.
a diag that, for example, calibrates or validates some sort of equipment, and it has to step through a series of different input values or something, right? Like, so I always like to use a step like a fan test, right? So you can have a step where it's we capture the measurements of the fans at 50%, and it emits RPM and I don't know the duty cycle as measurements. And then if a second input value is provided, so there's a second step here. Now it's at 100%, and now there's a third one, there's a 75%, right? And so that we would have the measurements of RPM and duty cycle that are just standardized measurement names. There's a step that captures that these are for this test condition, these are at this other test condition, these are at these other test condition. And so that is kind of the idea. And a lot of the stuff comes from having historical diags that did way too much. And so collecting that instead of breaking it up into like smaller unique diags, it was necessary to have the concept of like, well, this is the section where we're measuring temperatures, and this is the section where we're doing something else, and this is the section where we're doing something else. So the chronological aspects of a diag of if we failed at this step, like this is where we're installing some packages. Here's where we're setting something up. Here's where we're configuring or adding the load, and here's where we're making measurements, and now we're changing the load and we're making measurements again. So that whole concept is stepwise, so that we can ensure that the flow got followed, or what happened, what didn't happen, what didn't need, etc., and also which data, where does this data belong to, and at which point did this say like, hey, the fan was too slow. The diagnostic of what, oh, that was during the 75% step. So that's why the step kind of matters.
So this is similar to the previous discussion with the LMT tool, right? And what I was calling the test fixture, maybe we should call it test conditions. Because you say, okay, I am now exercising the fan at 50%, or I am now offsetting the PCI lane margining by 5 millivolts, and these are the measurements that I got out of this scope. So that's why I was saying that the test step is like maybe an atomic unit of scope inside the test.
Going back to my cell phone testing days, we may have a test that does an ILPC measurement, inner loop power control measurement, and step through a bunch of power levels, and we may have to do it across different bands of the 3G specs, so like at band 1, band 2, band 3, band 4. So I would run a diag, and it would return a different step where I did this frequencies, and then I did it again, but on a different frequency. So that's the sort of thing where the steps come in.
I'm happy that this discussion actually comes back to the test conditions thing that we may actually add as a different message to the spec, because essentially it is saying that for this test step we have these conditions for that we place the hardware and some expectations out of it, right?
Yeah, and if you can write the diag differently, such that the step is like I have a setup and I do my measurements and I clean up or whatever, and then execute the diag again under different conditions externally. But if a diag is written to do that internally, then steps are required to be able to differentiate that.
No, Vincent.
Yeah, this discussion makes me realize that I don't recall us discussing a lot of sort of reruns in the context of the diagnostic output, which a test step often is tied to. So you may have a failure at a particular step, you may have a rerun. I don't want to go there right now, but it just something that sort of triggered, tickled my brain as you guys were talking about the test step semantics. And a very common thing is that if you fail at step 13 out of 20, you may rerun your diag from 13 onwards after having modified something, possibly. But the question I wanted to get to, Adrian, was back to the question as you put it in the meeting notes. Could you maybe re-clarify, given that we do have diagnosis on the test step artifact, did you mean to say how does the interplay between the diagnostic we have on the test step play with the test run, and how do we combine those, or were you trying to ask a deeper question on the meaning of the diagnosis on the test step versus the test run artifacts?
No. What I was saying was diagnosis does not exist on the tests. On one of them. Let me look right now. So test step artifacts has a diagnosis, yes.
Yes.
It is the test run
run
artifact that doesn't have a diagnosis.
I see. Okay, so your question is, should we have a diagnosis at the test run level?
Yes. Now that you say that, I think my question is kind of inaccurate, because this came out of the fact that as a consumer, you want to look at the output and say everything is okay or everything is not okay. And to that extent, the test run has a test run end, right? And this has a status and a result. And the result, so the status is complete, whatever, so on. But the result says pass or fail. So I'm thinking that if you want to look at one particular thing to say whether the whole thing passed, you would look at the test result in the test run end. And then as to why something passed or failed, you need to go through the steps and look for diagnosis objects.
And there's the error on the test run artifact, right? So that also is where you can reference what really went wrong.
Yeah, so I think I kind of confused myself, and then I had this question, which is maybe a theme that came up before with the spec being a bit ambiguous. But now that I look at it, the spec actually covers this correctly. So I don't think we need a diagnosis at run level.
No, it's always helpful to have some of those discussions to revisit those use cases. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the discussion on this. So there's one more item that I added on the agenda, but George isn't here, and it was based on something that he commented on the GitHub discussion on HWI. I will ask it if there's nothing else to discuss right now, but I would have liked some context from him. In the meantime, if there's something else that anyone wants to raise within these 10 minutes, feel free to do so.
I have a quick thing. For some reason, the raise hand didn't pick up. It will be a quick thing, so then we can go into that discussion. Somebody at Meta brought up on an internal chat about a question on revisiting something we talked about briefly about sharing. Actually, they didn't bring it up exactly in this way, but it's ultimately about centralizing the output of the diagnostic runs in a way that's sort of easy to retrieve. So you build this sort of go-to database of the runs. And I remember we kind of touched on that at one point. The security world does this well with vulnerabilities, right? You can go to Ars Technica and there's all kinds of sharing of vulnerabilities that were found. So I think it would be an interesting goal or a point of discussion for 2024 to see to explore that one a little bit more. I've invited those folks to come by and introduce what they have in mind. I know they're kind of looking at this more meta internal first, but wanted to see if there's interest from Intel, Google, Microsoft, everybody who's on the call here. And in short, it's basically, if we were to run a diagnostic, one of our diagnostic, would there be value in sharing the output of that diagnostic within our community here? Or do we just keep it to ourselves?
I have a quick reply on that, because we were discussing this a while ago, out of the validation aspect. So if you want to run the spec validator on some outputs and see that it is okay. But I also think that these outputs may be useful as references for other people. So for example, you have a piece of hardware and you know that is exactly the same piece of hardware, and you look at it, okay, this is how a reference correct thing would behave, and it would output on this spec. It's a bit of off topic for the diagnostic itself, because if you think about it, the diagnostic package should already be able to tell you whether it is in spec or not, or whatever the diag tests. But I think it may still be useful as a reference output.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can pick that one up, and maybe I will invite them just to reintroduce their idea into the next year. I think from a CI perspective, there's value, but there may be also value from a vendor perspective, and an ODM perspective, where we could be building a database of types of failures of particular commodities, right? If we're running an SSD diag but it is a little sensitive, so I don't think we should take that one lightly. There is a benefit maybe to the industry, but there may be some confidentiality involved. So that's why I think it's worth discussing, and see where we may be straddling a bit of a sensitivity line between sort of organizational secrets or confidentiality and what benefits OCP.
Yeah.
One question I had. So these are runs on which hardware? I think that is a key question. If it's on a generic Linux kind of thing, maybe it is. But as you mentioned, if it is something internal to a company, then certainly there is some amount of confidentiality which comes. So the utility is not, at least in my mind, I'm not clear, like, what are the kind of test outputs do we want to share? Not questioning that it would be useful, it's about what could we actually...
Oh, Kiran.
Given the... Yeah, go ahead.
So just to be clear, I mean, we're talking about the output of the diagnostics where we are sharing already in the industry. So there should be, by virtue of those runs, the code itself is open source, right? We're putting it in OCP, and it would be the run of those diagnostic. Now, it could be that a field in the output, for whatever reason, maybe something a company is not yet willing to share, and that is going to be at the discretion of the company. But generally speaking, the code and the output of that execution are already in the open. I'm not talking about sharing anything proprietary.
So Kiran had another point, which was with the operating system and other test conditions, basically, because all of these are test conditions. The kernel, the system, the firmware on the baseboard, where you're testing a GPU, for example, right? And we have some discussion ongoing on that as well, on standardizing these parts, or at least having like an open source reference from them. Just wanted to mention that is in progress somewhere in the background, but it's a very long-term thing. For what you just said, Vincent, kind of an obvious example for that kind of stripping would be metadata, because usually you put, proprietary stuff in the metadata, and maybe you don't want that out. But obviously you could write like a stripping tool and say, okay, I'm gonna publish these outputs, but remove all of this sensitive data from it.
Yeah, I think we should pick up that discussion into the next year, because I think we may be expanding the scope and reach of the impact of this working group. I see a lot of commodity and component quality engineers today, track their DPPMs, the defective parts per million. And when they start seeing high elevated rates of defects, obviously there's a very close engagement with the vendors. The opportunity here is whoever of our working group here starts seeing elevated rates. If we build these databases, we may be really, identifying and finding those out earlier, which could benefit all of us. So I think there's something there, but it definitely needs to be fleshed out, because it's not going to be, it's going to require infrastructure as well, right? If we're going to build a database, a centralized database, and if we're going to put it in OCP, that's going to be an interesting thing to roll out.
And obviously need some kind of analysis tool as well, because just dumping the data is like, who's gonna look at millions of lines of data?
Yeah.
Okay. That was an interesting discussion. I don't know how to put this on the agenda for next year. Maybe we'll just randomly come back to this at some point, Vincent.
I'll see if I get the folks involved to come and maybe tease that what they have in mind, and that will help. I'll reach out to them and schedule them on one of the calls.
Okay, that works. Okay, so we're 4 minutes from the end. I think we can end here. Happy holidays, everyone, and thanks for joining today. And see you next week. Bye.
Bye.